Hello, I am Peter Bell, and it's my pleasure to share an interview with Mr. Adrian Smith, president of ML Gold, regarding the STARS project. Listen in on our conversation from March 29th, 2018, about this exciting porphyry exploration project.
For porphyries, you have this larger scale halo, which is predominantly defined by pyrite, and in your classic perfect scenario, it's a perfect ring. But often that's not the case. It's usually broken up, or it could be faulted after, or there could be various reasons why it doesn't form a perfect ring. But what we're seeing is that the chargeability that was drilled historically was associated with pyrite, because pyrite is, the most chargeable mineral of the group, so it lights up the most. So when the historic drilling was targeting the highest chargeability, what they ended up seeing was predominantly pyrite mineralization. So when we came in with ML Gold, we followed up with the best historic mineralogy, being the chalcopyrite indications in the historic hole 7, and we drilled around that, and we saw similar grades as what they had historically. We saw that it was associated with a larger system. It wasn't confined to a small narrow zone, but we've shown that across over a kilometer area we get chalcopyrite mineralization in veining, and what we're trying to kind of hone in on is where that veining is the highest density and where it has the best mineral assemblages associated with it. So obviously we want to find a higher temperature potassic zone with more bornite mineralization. Just having bornite mineralization, you actually have a higher percentage of copper associated with the mineral. There's 50% copper in bornite, where there's only 30% copper in chalcopyrite. So you could have the same density of veining with a different mineral assemblage, can actually give you significantly higher grades. So that's part of the reason why we want to zone in and find that higher temperature core. It also should be associated with the highest density of that mineralization, and it should have the greatest vertical depth extent. So that's really the name of the game for us going forward, is to use all the different remote sensing techniques, such as our airborne geophysical survey, incorporating with the historic IP that was done, albeit it was very shallow IP, only reaching 80 to 100 meters deep. We have to take all these things into consideration, but foremost is the actual geology, the actual mineralogy is what we see as being the most important indicators to follow.
Wonderful. And I've clicked record here on the little device, Adrian, so we're live. Thanks very much. Talking about the magnetic image here you released in the recent news release from ML Gold, the STARS project. You're speaking of the mineralogy there and how it's guided you towards potential center of the porphyry system. The magnetic highs off around the periphery there, is that just magnetite, fair to assume there, that's driving that, or do you have a sense?
So what we see is the primary host rock in the area, the country rock, is a volcanic unit that is very fairly mafic. It is more of a basaltic andesite, and it has a high primary magnetite component. And so what we see is this being a skarn-type magnetic front around an intrusion that is showing your potential skarn or your halo around that intrusion. So, in some cases it could be associated with mineralization, as we saw in the hole 4 area. However, it doesn't necessarily have a direct association with the copper mineralization. What it's showing us is where the system is centered. What we're seeing is that there is an uneven leveling of magnetic anomalies within the center of this magnetic ring that could be associated with a porphyry system that is taking advantage of that same conduit that the overall larger scale Pluton has come up through. So the magnetics is really our overall roadmap of where the major plumbing is in this system.
Okay. And looking at kind of the orientation of hole 4 there in a video that you guys have out that's quite informative, it seems like it's kind of, pointing off in the east-northeast direction away from the porphyry core there, indicated where you believe it may be. The high grade at surface there and the kind of rich copper grades through a lot of that hole for number 4, lots of questions about that.
I'd like to touch on that now that you mentioned it. It's kind of an important point, and a lot of people have asked about that. And there's 2 different scenarios, 2 different potential kind of upsides to this property, to the Stars property. One is in the marginal areas of the intrusion, on the margin of the contact, where you're actually getting a lot of your mineralization in the volcanics. And that's what the predominant mineralization style is at the Huckleberry mine, which is approximately 60 kilometers to the south. They were successful in defining an economic ore body there, based primarily on pyrite, chalcopyrite mineralization in veining in the volcanics on the periphery. So that's the exact same style of mineralization that we're seeing on the margin near hole 4. But the other bigger upside potential that is not necessarily reflected in the grades of the copper that we're seeing, but in the sulfidation state with the mineralogy, the actual sulfide mineral, is telling us that as we go towards the center of what the magnetics is interpreting and inferring as a center core, the mineralogy is also telling us the same thing. It's going from pyrite and chalcopyrite mixed in hole 4, which again is similar to the Huckleberry, but is then transitioning to chalcopyrite only in holes 2 or 1 and 3. And in holes 2, we're actually seeing to get bornite introduced into that hole with the chalcopyrite. So that's a clear, gradual increase in temperature. And we're seeing something very similar to the south. So separately, away from hole 4, we're seeing hole 5 being chalcopyrite dominated towards hole 6, where we actually start to see bornite being introduced with the chalcopyrite. So although there's not significant grades associated with these holes that are getting closer, they're not within that target area. The target area is still over 1 kilometer in diameter, which is consistent with a typical hydrothermal cell associated with the porphyry system. So there's the potential that these wisps, these higher grade kicks that we're seeing on the periphery are conduits that are allowing some of the copper fluids to be expelled from the center of the system, but not necessarily representing that it is the center of the system.
Yep.
And we can base that also not just on the mineral sulfide assemblage, but also on the alteration assemblage. We're looking for that potassic rich alteration. What we're not seeing in hole 4 is a really intense potassic overprint. There is potassic margins to the veins that are mineralized, but it's not indicative of a potassic core. So all these indications that we're seeing, not only in the sulfide mineral assemblage, but in the alteration, indicate that, on the margin, we're getting economic mineralization. It is near surface, and it is worth following it up, and we will follow up on that. But it's telling us that there could be something much larger here, which is the really exciting part.
Yeah. And in hole 2, there seemed to be a little purple section in the bottom of that mineralized.
So yeah, we're seeing what is not considered normal to get in a porphyry system, like high grade, massive sulfide, predominantly chalcopyrite veins. We have talked to other experts in the industry as far as they can tell us this is not normal, but it's not something that they haven't seen before. It's more higher level, intermediate argillic kind of is a term that comes to mind as far as a zonation that you could see this type of thing in.
Yep.
And so that indicates to us, based on some other factors that we're seeing as well, as one of the things being muscovite alteration as opposed to sericite alteration, indicates a potential higher level in the system. So we're potentially at an ideal situation where we're right at the top of a porphyry system here. We're just getting into the margins of it, and there could be a core right in the middle of our property. So,
And how's the local topography is pretty nice and gentle. Is there any indication of extreme faulting or reorientation of any of the units around here?
Well, one of the really interesting things with the faulting, now that you mentioned the faulting, is that when you're hunting for a porphyry system, you're looking for these large-scale structures that are interrupted by an intrusion, not necessarily that are faulted by an intrusion. There could obviously be pre and post faulting scenarios, but what you really want to see is you want to see a structure that has been infilled by an intrusion, and we see indications of that in our magnetic survey, and that's really one of the key hallmarks of a good porphyry system, is that you get a nice hydrothermal system intruding and filling up, interrupting a fault system. As far as the topography goes, it's in a relatively low-lying relief area. It's it's mostly covered by glacial till. There's very few outcrops on the property, which is one of the reasons why this property still exists. Yeah. It wasn't until 1998, which is extremely recently in BC standards, that a logging road developing New Cut Block actually pushed through and exposed a small outcrop that was well mineralized with copper. And that's what really started this whole process back in 2000, 2001. And it kind of sat dormant until ML Gold came along and scooped it up.
Yeah. Yeah, the pictures of that road showing are pretty beautiful.
Yeah, there's no shortage of copper on the property, so that's one of the exciting things, is just finding out, where is the highest concentration of it, and where can we potentially put a pit in.
And hole number 7 from 2001, kind of curious, where is that in relation to this donut and hole 4?
Well, so when we came into work on this project, hole 7 was historically the best hole that was on the property, and it was never followed up on. So it's right in the middle of our first holes 1 through 3, and we were initially trying to follow up with that and determine, from this one location where we know, I always like to start with something that's known. From this one location where we know there is copper in the bedrock, which direction can we then follow it? So early on, we were not really tuned into the whole sulfide mineral assemblages, and we were just purely following the amount or the grades of copper. And so we saw that there was a potential to get increased grades towards hole 4. So holes 1, 2, and 3 were drilled around hole 7, the historic hole, and hole 4 was actually drilled away from it into one of the historic chargeabilities. And what we saw is that we were intersecting copper not only in the intrusive, but we were getting it in the volcanics as well. So we knew that we were on the margin of the system, and that we were getting really nice copper grades in these nice chalcopyrite-rich veins. So there's the potential. That zone hasn't been followed up on. Right now we have a permit that's just being finalized with the government to increase our number of sites in that area, to go and expand that and to drill around it and potentially increase the overall intercepts and also the grade.
Yeah, that's great. And so again, hole 7, was it right around 1, 2, 3, and 4 there?
Yeah, so hole 7 was around holes 1, 2, and 3 were spaced around holes, okay, the historic hole 7. Hole 4 was drilled away from hole 7.
And I can't imagine your surprise, really. Like, it's the more I'm looking at it.
Honestly, we thought the best that we were going to get was in the first 3 holes, and hole 4 was absolutely it was a welcome surprise.
What was the thinking of pointing off in that direction at that time?
It was just trying to get a vector of which direction to go. If I could, I would sit in one spot where there's cover, where you don't know what's underneath you, and drill in every direction. And using all that information together, you can actually infer which direction the system is getting better. So that's really where that stems from.
Right. And those 4 holes have been able to do that for you pretty significantly.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of counterintuitive too, right? Like, we've been talking with a lot of larger companies, a lot of majors. We've been reviewing all our information with several well known porphyry experts, and the thing is that they understand that the public doesn't necessarily understand is that the grades aren't always the indicating factor.
Yeah.
It's more about the actual geology and the minerals in the rock that can lead you towards your best zone. And so that's what we're really trying to work towards. And obviously we want to continue developing around hole 4, but we also want to find the best potential area on this property.
Yeah. Well, and delineating that is a massive undertaking after you even find it, right? So. Absolutely, yeah. Good to be hearing some talk with the majors potentially help with the heavy lifting there. I noticed. Yeah, no, it's a key strategy moving forward. I noticed you guys have an option to earn 80%. I'm kind of familiar with the Pacific Empire story and saw that you had optioned 30% of it from them. I didn't realize that the other owner had given you an option for their 50%. Yeah, so it was done to acquire up to 80%. Pacific Empire is a project generator, and part of their business model is to have a retained interest in these projects. But they are very a friendly group to deal with, and they have expressed the interest to do another three-way JV if that option is on the table, and to work with a larger group if they do come to the table and want to do something. So it's a very good partnership and group to work with. Yeah, the carried interest that they'd negotiated for themselves up to a PEA or a PFS, I'm not sure which, puts them in a nice position. Yeah, it allows them to have some potential upside and to see if it gives us a chance as the optioner or the optionee to take the project and for lower amounts up front to determine if there is something we're chasing here, and so far it looks like there is. Yeah. So we'll have to carry them to a preliminary economic stage, and at that point they'll have to start being a contributing partner. And maybe just to go back to where we first started off here, the IP chargeability as well. I believe you mentioned that was done by a prior operator at the project, and it may not have been reaching such great depths, but there's a pretty screaming chargeability high right around hole 7 and 4 and everything there now, and the soil sampling lines covering that, a couple high-grade hits from the soil nearby. So. Yeah, I mean, IP is one of those things that it only reaches a certain depth, especially in the historic surveys, and it doesn't always indicate where your actual ore zone is, but it gives you a good system or a good idea of where the system is on a hole. So yeah. It's one of those data sets that you have to take in accordance with all your other information and use it collectively together to get your best targets. Mr. Adrian Smith, ML Gold Corp, listed on the Toronto Stock Venture, MLG. Thanks very much for talking with me. Thanks for having me.